everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of The County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Recently, I had an opportunity to attend a land conference in Salt Lake City, the American Lands Council, and one of the presenters was an attorney from Wyoming, and the information that she gave was of such interest that we invited her to come to the county seat and talk a little bit about regulations and the regulatory agencies and how, from her perspective, they've become a little out of hand. So we welcome Harriet Hageman from Hageman Law PC, and as I understand it, you are a water and natural resources attorney from Cheyenne, Wyoming.
That's correct.
Thank you so much for taking the time and the effort to come all the way back to Salt Lake to sit with us for half an hour.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I was, quite frankly, just my jaw kept dropping during your presentation at this conference about, in particular, this self-perpetuating stream of money that does not show, that agencies take in, that does not show up in their budgets from Congress. Could you explain a little bit about how that works?
Well, what has happened is that we're now in the environment in this country where so much of the law that is being made is actually being made by regulatory agencies. And by that I mean they are adopting, they go through a rulemaking process, and they're adopting regulations that are allegedly based upon certain statutory provisions. So for example, we all know what Obamacare is. There are over 18,000 pages of regulations that have been adopted, in addition to the 2,700 pages of the law itself. You have the same kind of situation with the Endangered Species Act, and you have the same kind of situation with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. What is happening is that with the kinds of regulations that are being adopted and that are being enforced against the citizens of this country is that there is quite often a permitting requirement associated with those. Sometimes it's statutory, sometimes it's just through the regulations themselves. So I will use the Clean Water Act as an example. The Clean Water Act requires, under certain circumstances, a 404 permit.
Well, what is a 404?
A 404 permit is it allows the person who gets it to put dredged or filled material in a, quote, navigable water of the United States. Well, when the statute was adopted in the 1970s, a navigable water of the United States was pretty easy to understand. I mean, it's the Mississippi River, it would be the North Platte River, it would be something of that magnitude that is quite possibly, typically, going to have interstate significance. But what has happened is that the regulatory agencies are now applying that not just to a navigable water of the United States, but anything that they define as a navigable water of the United States. It can be a pothole, it can be an irrigation ditch, it can be an irrigation canal, it can be ripples of water in the sand. This all comes from the United States Supreme Court decision that was issued in 2006 called Rapinos. So you have to get this permit. You have to get a 404 permit if you're going to move an irrigation ditch, for example. At least that's what the EPA and the Corps of Engineers say. I disagree. I do not believe that you are required to get a 404 permit. But the problem is, if you don't get a 404 permit, you can be sued by the EPA and they can fine you $37,500 per day. Well, it takes, on average, over 700 days to get a 404 permit, and it costs almost $300,000 for an average 404 permit. So if I am an irrigator, if I'm a farmer and I move an irrigation ditch, the way that the EPA looks at it is that I have to go to them and get a permit. But that may take as long as 2 years to obtain that permit. Here's where the self-funding comes in. Here's where the money comes in. When I want to do that, that money, that permit application, the type of investigation and things that have to be done are done by the Corps of Engineers, typically, sometimes perhaps the EPA, but more often it's through the Corps of Engineers. Well, the more permits that they get to issue, the more permits you have to apply for, the more employees that they have to investigate those permits, to determine whether you've met all of their requirements, to develop mitigation obligations and that sort of thing. So what they've done is that they basically are becoming self-funding, or in large part, they're bringing in a lot of funding for their employees by requiring us to get a permit under a law that doesn't require us to get a permit, but they're funding their own agencies by doing the investigations associated with those permits.
And by adding the regulations to do those that never had to clear the muster of Congress.
Exactly.
And so how much money does that amount to?
I don't know, but I can tell you that I know it's millions, because when you look at the Rapinoe, well, probably much more than millions. I would say at least in the hundreds of millions, if not more. And the reason that I say that is when you look at the Rapinoe decision, for example, it gives some of the statistics. And as I said, the average 404 permit costs over $288,000, I believe it is, and it takes over 2 years. 717 days, I believe, is approximately what it takes. So that is money for every single 404 permit that is obtained in this country. That's the kind of money we're talking about. That's the average number. If you're going in to build a building, if you were to go in and build a construction project, if you were to go in and build a pipeline, it's going to be thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to get those permits. So what you're talking about is agencies are now becoming, I wouldn't say self-funded. They still get a lot of money from Congress. Obviously, Congress, when you look at our debt and you look at our deficit, Congress is obviously spending an enormous amount of money on agency actions, if you will, or in funding the EPA, the Forest Service, the Department of Ag, and all of those. But it is one of the ways in which they are self-perpetuating themselves.
So it's basically job security.
It's job security. And the longer they take, the more job security it is. We have created a very bizarre business model that actually rewards agencies to take as much time as they possibly can when doing an EIS, for example, an environmental impact statement. So let's say I'm going to be building a pipeline and I have to cross certain federal lands. If I have to go through the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and I have to get an EIS, by statute, it is the agency that has to do that EIS. If you read NEPA, it specifically states that that agency must conduct the EIS.
So by their own regulation, they make more money.
That's exactly right.
At the taxpayer's cost outside of taxes, so to speak.
Exactly.
This is an excellent place to take a break. While our head clears, we'll be right back with the county seat.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo River. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
There is a place where looking out means looking in, where an impression lasting only a few seconds will be imprinted on a life forever, where courage is forged and innocence rediscovered, where remembering is rewarding and forgetting unforgettable. There is a place where truth is felt and where seeing is believing. There is a place.
What do you picture when you hear Rich County, Utah? Bear Lake adventure, snowmobile action, pristine skiing, spectacular solitude. Well, if that isn't what first came to mind, then you just don't know Rich County. The Bear Lake Monster Polar Plunge, snowmobiling Monte Cristo, ice fishing Bear Lake, skiing the backcountry, fishing at the Cisco Disco. Come and find out what you never knew you were missing. Rich County, Utah.
In a place that is beyond words, there is nothing to be said, except take your time in Bryce Canyon country.
Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking with Harriet Hageman, a natural resource and water attorney from Cheyenne. This was kind of head swimming to look at this entire regulatory revenue flow that comes from the permitting process and all the regulations and fines. It's just basically, it almost sounds like you can't spend a day without breaking a law.
That's what is often stated, that you break 3 laws every single day.
So if that's the case, what kind of impact is that having on what our basic constitutional tenets are of the basic freedoms of pursuit of property, pursuit of happiness, all the things that the Constitution was about.
Well, the government, the way that our government was set up and why it is unique and why it was unique at the time that our forefathers put together the Constitution and formed the federal government and the type of republic that we have. We don't have a democracy, we have a republic. We have a representative form of government. And what they recognized or what they believed was that the government was to serve the citizens. The citizens were not to serve the king, which was the very type of government that they were escaping, the very type of government that they fought against. We're not here to serve the government. The government is here solely to serve us. What has happened with this regulatory regime and what has happened with this mentality shift coming out of Washington, D.C. is that citizens really are becoming subjects again. Our government is taking away our rights. They're taking away our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're doing so through a variety of mechanisms. One of the things that I deal with pretty extensively has to do with conservation easements. And what I have found through conservation easements and the use of conservation easements, they sound really good on paper, but what we're doing is we're federalizing our private property rights. Right now, the federal government owns over 650 million acres in the United States. It owns 1/3 of the surface estate in the United States. That was never supposed to be the form of government that we had. Our forefathers never envisioned that our federal government would own that kind of real property. But in my view, that's enough. What you're seeing is that they're also using other mechanisms to now control private property as well. One of those is through the use of conservation easements. And what they're doing is they are dictating private land use and management through the IRS, if you can even believe that. I think a lot of people are very surprised by that, but it's the IRS that actually sets the policies about how conservation easements have to be written and what kinds of restrictions need to be placed on property. But what we're doing with conservation easements is we're actually, because they're perpetual, the way I refer to it is that we are able to dictate today how we are going to be managing private property in 2496, the year 2496, or the year 3952. It doesn't matter. And it's like saying that people in 1596 should have been able to set policies dictating how we're going to be using our land today. We would look at that and say that is an absurdity. Yet that is exactly what we're doing with conservation easements, and we're doing it through the auspices of the IRS. And in the meantime, we are also taking one of the most important assets that most farmers and ranchers, for example, have, and we're reducing the value of it dramatically. That's where the tax credits come in. That's why the IRS is involved.
But that's a voluntary inducement. You lure a rancher or farmer into putting the conservation easements in for a tax break, right? Isn't that how that works?
That is one of the ways that it works. But think about that. The reason that there is a tax break is because your property is worth a certain amount of value before the conservation easement, and it's worth substantially less than that after the conservation easement is placed on it, because you've taken away one of the most important rights associated with private property ownership, which is the right to make decisions about how it is developed, how it's used, how it's managed, and those kinds of things. We refer to it often as a bundle of sticks, and the bundle of sticks gives you certain rights as a private property owner. A conservation easement essentially takes that right away, gives it to a third party, oftentimes the federal government. The USDA actually has enforcement authority on many of the conservation easements that are applied to lands in the United States. Again, we're federalizing private property rights.
Holy smokes. Wow. I don't even have a comeback for that, other than maybe we should talk about what we do about it when we come back. You're watching The County Seat, an interesting conversation with Harriet Hageman, a natural resources and water attorney from Wyoming. This is interesting stuff, folks. We'll be right back with The County Seat in just a minute.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. Oh, there ain't nothing like being raised in the basin with a Ute reservation, skiing starvation, that Duchesne County life.
Unlimited opportunity for adventure. It's all about knowing where to look. ATV adventures, rock crawling events, art festivals, and wildlife events. The opportunities are limitless. Pick your adventure in Millard County.
Beautiful scene, isn't it? The great wide spaces of the wild, wild west. Hi, I'm Chad Booth, host of At Your Leisure. I'm asking you to support the Blue Ribbon Coalition. Their efforts responsibly preserve access to our public lands. If it were not for the Blue Ribbon Coalition and their efforts, you may not have access to millions of acres of land across the West. This is America's playground, and if we don't do anything, we are going to lose it. Join, participate, and donate.
The weekends just never feel like they're long enough. By the time you get to a destination, you're worn out and you may need a vacation to recover from your last vacation. The solution is closer than you think, and that's just what you need. You can find the desert at Little Sahara, the cool refreshment of Yuba Lake, escape to the green of the forest on the Nebo Loop. Make your escape to Juab County. It'll change your family forever.
Welcome back to the County Seat. We are having a conversation with Harriet Hageman, who is a natural resources and water attorney who has a very interesting perspective on the regulatory agencies and how they are entwining themselves in our lives and actually taking away constitutional rights. So from your perspective, you have painted a very grim picture that you have money is power. You have agencies that are developing their own money without that functions free of congressional oversight. In fact, Congress doesn't even know where it's coming from. And then you're claiming that their regulatory power is taking away our rights, our property rights, significantly, and some of even our other rights. So how do we fix the problem? Because everybody's afraid of the federal government. What do you do?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. I think we need to do a better job of educating our young in this country in terms of understanding why the United States was a grand experiment that was a very different viewpoint, a very different philosophy than what you had seen throughout the world before. And that was, again, that the power resides in the citizens, not in the king. We need to come back to the idea that we shouldn't be afraid of our federal government. Our federal government should not be our enemy, yet that really is in large part what has happened. It's an enemy of landowners, of business owners, of producers, and that is a very sad state of affairs that we're in. I think there are a variety of things that can be done. One of them I think that is very, very important, although it does not sound as exciting as some of the other ideas, and I think it's truly tax reform. When they started the income tax in 1913, the idea was that the federal income tax would actually be very limited. 3, 4, 5%, it would just simply be to fund those things that the federal government is supposed to do. Well, right now our top rate is 40%. The taxing authority should reside with the states because every state is different. Every state is unique. Every state has its own personality and philosophy, and it should. It makes for a very robust governance. It makes for the ability for people to make choices that if they don't like how Nevada is being run, they can move to Montana or they can move to Iowa or Ohio. But Wyoming is not Wisconsin, Colorado is not Connecticut, New York is not New Mexico. All of us have unique attributes, and that is a very important way that we get to experiment with different ways of governing our citizens, if you will. So one of the things that needs to be done is tax reform. We need to stop laundering our money through Washington, D.C. The citizens of Wyoming, the citizens of Utah, the citizens of Nevada, they are taxed at the federal level. That money is taken away from their states. It goes through Washington, D.C. It's laundered through a variety of agencies and for a variety of purposes. And then they very kindly, as they act, return it to the states. We're constantly hearing about, well, if you don't do this, the federal government is going to take away your highway funds. I mean, how many times has the state of Wyoming, for example, been told, if you don't raise your speed limit, if you don't lower your BAC for blood alcohol content for driving, we're going to take away your money. My reaction is, it's not your money, federal government, to start with.
In Utah, that issue is over health care because we haven't signed on to the expansion of Medicaid. And so that's the big argument that goes between our governor and the legislature and the people here.
We need to take that power away from the federal government. That isn't the federal government's money to blackmail the states. It's our money, and the citizens, we ought to be able to keep as much money as we can in the state of Wyoming to pay for our own roads, to pay for our own schools, to pay for the kinds of things that the citizens of Wyoming want.
But how do you do that? I mean, that requires a reduction of federal power, and none of these agencies are going to want to give that up voluntarily, let alone Congress or the president. This
isn't an easy road, but we have to start somewhere. And the other thing that I truly believe is I believe that our state governors, our legislators, and our county commissioners have got to start asserting a lot more power and authority and simply looking at the federal government and saying, we're not going to do that. We don't agree with that. That is not what our philosophy is. That is not what we want to be. We have got to start pushing back. We need strong governors. We need really strong governors who are willing to stand up and fight for their citizens.
As a litigator who's done a lot of federal cases, do you really think that there's a sufficient strength in numbers if you have a united front with governors and county commissioners and city mayors across the entire country that say enough is enough, that the federal government will back down, or will they declare martial law?
No, I do think that they will back down, and there's a couple of reasons why I say that. One is we have two examples right now that demonstrates that the federal government is concerned about citizen strength, if you will. One of them is the marijuana law in Colorado. Not that I necessarily agree with that, but that's a violation of federal law. The feds aren't enforcing it. Another one is sanctuary cities. Again, I don't agree with the philosophy of that, yet what you see is that the federal government is not going into those communities and enforcing federal law. Now, there's a political reason behind all of that, but that's where we change the politics. We need to give backbones to our leaders. We need to make sure that our leaders are representing us, and we need to be pushing back against that federal government.
So I'm going to leave this with a thought to carry us over to our next break. How do you do that? It sounds like it's incumbent upon us as taxpayers to do this.
Yes,
okay.
I believe so.
Great. We're going to take a minute. We'll come back with our wrap-up here on the county seat.
When the road takes you farther than you knew possible, when the world is more beautiful than you've ever seen, when home is more comfortable than it should be, this is when you know you're in Kane County. The perfect mix of rural and urban, culture and adventure. Glendale, Orderville, Kanab, Bigwater, small towns with more to offer than just peace and quiet. Kane County, Utah. Find the new you.
149 million years in the making, dinosaurs once roamed this land. Now they're found at the Dinosaur National Monument. Let's take you beyond the bones. We call it Dinosaur Land. You'll find it offers adventures and sights not seen anywhere else in the world. Come to Dinosaur Land, Vernal, Utah. You'll want to stay forever. The dinosaurs did.
ATV? Check. Four-wheel driving? Check. Bouldering? Check. Mountain biking? Check. Hiking? Check. River rafting? Check. Adventure is about more than just crossing activities off of a list, but hey, if you can find a place that gives you everything you're looking for, all the better. In Emery County, you'll find the San Rafael Swell, trails, lakes, and the small-town hospitality you're looking for. San Rafael Country, in the heart of Utah. Visit us and check something off your list.
Welcome back to the county seat. We've had a very interesting conversation with Councilor Hageman today. Thank you for taking the time. You talked about the fact that it really is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are demanding from our local leaders strength. But how do we prepare ourselves to demand that of them?
Well, I think that there's a variety of ways, and one is we have to do a better job of educating our young about the significance of the Constitution, why it was created the way that it was, what the rights mean. The fact is we have the legal framework to address all of the issues that I have identified today and actually resolve them in fairly quick order if we have the backbone to do it, if we have the strength to do it, and we have the leaders to do it who are willing to carry this battle forward, if you will. But the Constitution, as I've indicated a couple of times, protects us from the government, not the other way around. We need to be making sure that we are electing people who understand the very foundation of what our country is and the very foundation of our constitutional rights. We have constitutional rights that not only are at the federal level, but also at the state level. What a lot of people don't understand is the constitutional rights that are identified at the federal level are actually a floor. A lot of state constitutions provide broader and more robust rights than the federal Constitution does. But so many of our leaders, even our state legislators, don't always remember we have a constitution in Wyoming. We have a constitution in Utah that we should be relying upon and pointing to make sure that we are protecting all of those civil liberties. We need to have a discussion. We need to have a nationwide discussion with our representatives in Congress and what their role is. The only reason that a senator or a representative goes to Washington is to represent me and you.
Now there'll be a difference of opinion here, though, because there'll be some people who will say, well, that's just a very ultra-conservative, Republican, extremely right-wing statement to make. But how do you apply that across the board to somebody who thinks that there's another role? How do you make that constitutional argument for them?
Well, I think it's very simple, and again, you go back to the very basis of our Constitution. And the reason that we've always described it as a grand experiment, and the reason we've always described the United States as being unique, is because it is the citizen that has the freedoms. And so, being a republic rather than a democracy, in a republic, we send our representatives to represent us. So again, in Wyoming, we have a philosophy, we have a culture, if you will. You do in New Mexico, you do in Montana. Those are the types of differences, those are the types of cultures that our representatives need to be representing and taking to heart when they go back there. But the other thing that they have to recognize is that the federal government is, by design, to be a very limited government. It is not to dictate every aspect of our lives. I have articles of where the Department of USDA is in fact forcing magicians to get licenses for their bunnies that they use in their acts. Why would the USDA be involved in any of that? Why is the USDA involved in telling us how to do s'mores over a fire? We have allowed our federal government to become far too big. The dialogue now is how we need to get that shrunk back down to a reasonable size so that we can make sure that we are fulfilling our full potential, I guess you'd say, and carrying out the Constitution the way it was intended.
Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. This has been a very interesting conversation. Be sure to share this with your friends, and we will look for you next week on the County Seat. If you'd like to share this video with your friends, well, you do that right here. If you would like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you do that over here. If you'd like to interact with us on the County Seat, that happens over here. If you want to watch the next episode of the County Seat, you can catch it Saturday night at 11 or Sunday morning at 8:30 on ABC4 Good for Utah.